Hey, before we dive into this dark, twisted story that's shaking America and igniting controversy nationwide, smash like, subscribe, and comment below if you want full coverage of this case as it unfolds. Hit that bell so you never miss an update. It was early on a Monday morning in February, President's Day. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon in Savannah, Georgia, and for one woman, it was supposed to be an ordinary day of preparation, planning lessons, and shaping young minds. That woman was Dr. Linda Davis, a 52-year-old special education teacher admired by colleagues, cherished by students, and beloved by her community. To them, she wasn't just an educator. She was a guardian of potential, a champion for children who struggled, and a constant source of warmth and reassurance for every child who crossed her classroom threshold. People.com. But on that fateful morning, the ordinary would become unthinkable. It began with a truck, a red pickup truck, driven by a 38-year-old man named Oscar Vasquez Lopez, a Guatemalan national living in the United States without authorization and subject to a final deportation order issued in 2024. AP News. ICE, the Federal Immigration Enforcement Agency, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, spotted Lopez's vehicle and attempted to stop it. What happened next is a chilling sequence of events that would leave a community in mourning and a nation questioning enforcement priorities, interagency communication, and public safety. According to federal authorities, Lopez initially pulled over when officers activated their lights and sirens. But as the agents approached, something shifted. Suddenly, Lopez bolted. He sped away, then moments later, made a reckless U-turn at speed and ran a red light. That's when it happened. His truck skidded into the path of another vehicle, the one driven by Dr. Davis. https://www.wvva.com. The crash was catastrophic. Dr. Davis's car was struck with such force that she sustained fatal injuries. Despite the quick arrival of emergency crews, she was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after the collision. The community would later describe the scene as surreal. A beloved and respected teacher, on her way to train and prepare for students, gone in an instant because of a violent impact from another driver's desperate attempt to escape law enforcement. https://www.wvva.com. The driver, Lopez, survived and was taken into custody. He was later charged with multiple crimes, including first-degree vehicular homicide, reckless driving, driving without a valid license, and failure to obey a traffic control device. https://www.wdoc.com. Even before investigators had time to process the physical evidence, the emotional aftermath rippled out across Savannah and across the country. The school where Dr. Davis taught, Herman W. Escalated, a school with a large Spanish-speaking population, was plunged into grief. Students, parents, and educators expressed disbelief. Social media accounts shared photos of Davis smiling with children, pictures of classroom walls bright with her students' artwork, and messages of heartbreak from former students and parents alike. She made you feel like you mattered, one colleague said, capturing the sentiment that spread to community like wildfire. https://www.kplctv.com. But this story, as tragic as it is, doesn't end or even begin with her death alone. Within hours of the crash, controversy erupted. First, there was the question of responsibility. Local police emphasized that they had no involvement whatsoever in the pursuit. The Chatham County Police Department publicly stated they weren't aware of any IC operation or chase when it happened, nor did they initiate it. Many local officers said they found out about the actions of federal agents only after the crash occurred. https://www.wvva.com. That fact ignited a firestorm. Savannah, like many cities, has a no-chase policy for local law enforcement, especially on busy streets near schools and residential areas. The policy was intentionally written to protect innocent people from the very scenario that unfolded on Whitefield Avenue. According to county officials, had local law enforcement been leading the situation, Lopez might have been stopped without a high-speed chase, potentially preventing the fatal collision. https://www.wvva.com. Those concerns exploded across community meetings, city council chambers, and social media feeds. Critics argue that federal agents had violated not just local policies, but unspoken trust, choosing to chase a suspect for a civil immigration violation in an area dense with schools and families. Supporters of enforcement pushed back, saying the fault lay solely with a man who chose to flee and recklessly endanger others. Throughout this uprising of emotion, officials from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, ICE's parent agency, released statements defending their actions. In one widely shared message, a DHS spokesperson called the crash an absolute tragedy and blamed the collision on the suspect's decision to flee rather than respond to lawful orders. Some DHS officials went further, suggesting that inflammatory political rhetoric surrounding immigration enforcement had contributed to a resistance that ended in loss of life. Yahoo! But that response only fueled the debate. At church halls, on local radio talk shows, and in online forums, arguments raged. Should federal agents be allowed to engage in high-speed pursuits in civilian areas? What responsibility does ICE have to coordinate with local law enforcement when their operations take place on public roads? And is the death of an innocent educator a cost worth paying for immigration enforcement? Within hours of the crash, a protest began near the scene. Citizens standing with handmade signs, candles, and photographs of Dr. Davis, lamenting the loss of a life they felt was taken far too soon. Why chase someone here? One protester asked, her voice trembling. Why risk lives for a traffic stop when a teacher could die? https://www.woc.com. Local leaders responded with urgency. The chairman of Chatham County called on federal authorities to engage with the community, to explain why agents initiated the pursuit and why local law enforcement was not informed. Others demanded a formal review of ICE's policies, arguing that these types of pursuits should only be undertaken for violent or dangerous suspects, not civil violations. https://www.wvva.com. Across the nation, the story drew attention from media outlets and civil rights groups alike. Analysts compared the case to past controversial pursuits that ended in fatal collisions and questioned whether federal agencies were subject to the same safety standards as local police departments. For many, Dr. Davis's death became a focal point in a larger conversation about enforcement tactics and public safety. Yahoo! Yet even amid national outrage and heated debate, the memory of Dr. Davis remained at the heart of the tragedy, not just as a tragic headline or a symbolic flashpoint, but as a real person with a vibrant life cut short. As news spread, strangers across the country shared stories of teachers who had touched their lives, reminding everyone that behind every viral news clip is a human story. By the next morning, Savannah wasn't just grieving, it was dividing. The memorial outside Herman W. Hezekiah 8 had grown overnight. Flowers, handwritten notes, a row of apples placed carefully beneath a framed photograph of Dr. Linda Davis, smiling beside her students. Someone had taped a quote beneath her picture. Every child deserves someone who believes in them. Parents stood in silence. Teachers clutched one another in the parking lot. Grief counselors moved between classrooms where students struggled to understand how a normal Monday could end in something so permanent. But while the school mourned, something else was happening across town. Federal authorities were doubling down. Officials from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security publicly stated that Oscar Vasquez Lopez had a final order of removal dating back to 2024. They described him as someone who had exhausted legal remedies and was subject to deportation. According to DHS, officers attempted a routine vehicle stop. They insisted there was no prolonged high-speed chase. Only a suspect who refused to comply and made a sudden, reckless maneuver that caused a crash. The language mattered. Routine stop. Suspect fled. Absolute tragedy. To federal officials, the narrative was clear. Responsibility lay solely with the driver. But locally, that framing didn't sit well. Chatham County leaders began asking questions publicly. Why were federal agents conducting enforcement actions in dense residential corridors without prior coordination? Why was a vehicle stop attempted during peak morning traffic near a school zone? And most critically, Did the federal agents follow the same pursuit safety standards that local law enforcement must obey? Savannah has strict chase limitations for a reason. Years earlier, city officials enacted policies designed to prevent exactly what had just happened: innocent bystanders becoming collateral damage in pursuit situations. Now a teacher was dead, and suddenly, the policy gap between federal and local enforcement felt enormous. At a county meeting packed with residents, tensions flared. Some speakers demanded icy halt operations within city limits. Others argued that immigration enforcement was necessary and that blame belonged solely to the man who ran the red light. The room fractured along political lines, but grief hovered over everyone. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together the crash itself. Traffic cameras confirmed the sequence. Lopez initially slowed when lights activated behind him. Then, without warning, he accelerated sharply. Witnesses described the truck making a fast, aggressive turn, cutting through a red signal at an intersection known for heavy commuter flow. Dr. Davis had the right of way. She never saw him coming. The impact crushed the driver's side of her vehicle. The force spun her car nearly 180 degrees before it struck a curb. Airbags deployed. Glass shattered across the asphalt. One witness later said the sound was like a bomb going off. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but survival had already slipped away. As news stations replayed footage of the wreckage, another layer of the story began surfacing: Lopez's background. Records showed prior immigration proceedings, but no violent criminal history had been publicly disclosed at that time. He was working construction jobs. He had family connections in the region. Neighbors described him as quiet. That revelation complicated the narrative even further. If this was a violent offender, why attempt a traffic stop in that moment? Why not surveil and arrest in a controlled environment? Federal officials countered. Agents cannot predict who will flee. Enforcement carries inherent risk. The responsibility remains with the individual who chooses to run. Civil rights advocates responded sharply. They argued that federal pursuit policies are less transparent than local ones, that IC operates under internal guidelines not always visible to public scrutiny, that without clear coordination, tragedies become more likely. And then came a detail that poured gasoline on the fire. Local police confirmed they were not informed of the enforcement operation beforehand. No heads up, no joint task force, no shared radio channel, just federal lights in a school zone. For some residents, that fact felt like a betrayal. Savannah is a city shaped by history, layered with tension around federal authority and local governance. This incident reopened old wounds about autonomy, oversight, and the balance between immigration enforcement and community safety. Within days, a candlelight vigil transformed into something larger. Protesters gathered not only to honor Dr. Davis, but to demand accountability. Some carried signs reading "Safety before politics." Others read "Justice for Linda." Yet across social media, a different reaction spread. Comment sections filled with fury, directed not at Icy, but at Lopez. This is what happens when people ignore deportation orders. Enforce the law. Period. He chose to run. He killed her. The country was arguing. Cable news panels dissected the timeline. Former law enforcement officials debated pursuit protocol. Immigration attorneys analyzed removal procedures. Political figures seized the moment, some calling for expanded enforcement, others demanding reform. Through it all, Dr. Davis's family remained largely silent. Until Friday, standing at a podium outside the school, her husband finally spoke. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with something heavier. "My wife believed in compassion," he said. "She believed in accountability, too. What happened to her should never happen to anyone." He did not mention IC directly. He did not mention immigration policy. He simply asked for a full, transparent investigation. And that word, transparent, became central, because behind closed doors, federal review processes were already underway. Internal assessments would determine whether agents adhered to policy. Body camera footage would be analyzed, dash cam recordings examined. But critics questioned whether those findings would ever be fully public. As the week progressed, another unsettling question emerged. Was the stop itself necessary at that time? Immigration enforcement is complex. Final removal orders can sit unexecuted for months or even years depending on coordination with foreign governments, detention space, and logistical planning. Why? Residents wondered, did this case escalate into a roadside stop that morning? DHS did not provide detailed operational reasoning, citing ongoing investigations, and that silence only amplified suspicion. Meanwhile, Lopez appeared in court. A judge denied bond. Prosecutors described the crash as a direct result of reckless, intentional flight. Defense attorneys argued panic. Fear, not malice. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Inside, a grieving family sat quietly in the gallery. The charges were severe. First-degree vehicular homicide carries significant prison time in Georgia. If convicted, Lopez could spend decades behind bars. But legal consequences, no matter how severe, would not resurrect a life devoted to children. As days turned into a week, the story evolved from a tragic accident into a national flashpoint. Federal enforcement versus local control. Policy versus humanity. Law versus loss. And beneath every headline was an uncomfortable truth. A single split-second decision to flee had cascaded into irreversible devastation. By the second week after the crash, the grief in Savannah had settled into something colder. Anger. Not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, focused, because investigators had finished reviewing the footage. And what it revealed wasn't a cinematic high-speed pursuit stretching across highways. It was something shorter. Messier, more avoidable. Internal reports confirmed the entire sequence, from attempted stop to fatal collision, lasted less than 2 minutes. 112 seconds. That was all it took. Body camera footage reportedly showed agents activating lights behind Oscar Vasquez Lopez's pickup truck. He slowed, nearly stopped. One agent exited his vehicle. Then Lopez accelerated. What followed was not a prolonged chase weaving through multiple neighborhoods. It was a rapid burst of speed down a busy morning corridor. Agents followed briefly, but did not disengage immediately. That decision, those seconds, became the center of everything. Because Savannah's local pursuit policy requires officers to disengage when public safety risks outweigh the necessity of immediate capture. ICE, operating under federal authority, follows a separate internal guideline, one that critics argue is less restrictive and less publicly transparent. And in that policy gap, a teacher lost her life. A preliminary review acknowledged that agents had the discretion to terminate the attempt once Lopez accelerated toward a heavily trafficked intersection. They were not explicitly prohibited from continuing, but they were empowered to assess risk dynamically. The report did not declare misconduct. It did not clear them either. Instead, it used language that ignited a firestorm nationwide. Agents acted within current federal pursuit framework. However, review of tactical judgment is ongoing. Tactical judgment. To Dr. Linda Davis's family, those words felt clinical, detached. Her husband released a second statement. If tactical judgment cost my wife her life, he said, then that framework needs a change. The statement went viral. Within days, lawmakers in Georgia called for a joint state-federal review panel. Advocacy groups demanded that ICE adopt local pursuit restrictions when operating inside municipal limits. Legal scholars debated whether federal agencies should be required to comply with city chase policies while working within city boundaries. Suddenly, this wasn't just about one crash. It was about jurisdiction, oversight, and who answers when federal authority intersects with local streets. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Lopez moved forward. Prosecutors reconstructed the crash in court using traffic simulations. They showed the red light, the speed calculation, the angle of impact. They emphasized choice, that Lopez made a conscious decision to flee. The defense argued panic, fear of deportation, fear of separation from family, fear of detention. They claimed he did not anticipate the catastrophic result, that his reaction was impulsive, not homicidal. But under Georgia law, intent to kill is not required for a first-degree vehicular homicide. Recklessness is enough. In a packed courtroom, Dr. Davis's sister delivered a victim impact statement that silenced everyone present. She woke up that morning thinking about her students, she said. He woke up thinking about escape. There were no cheers, no applause, only the weight of truth hanging in the air. Outside, national media continued dissecting the broader implications. Data analysts pointed out that federal immigration operations had increased in the region over the previous year. Critics argued that enforcement intensity without local coordination increases unpredictability. Supporters countered that noncompliance with removal orders carries consequences, and that fleeing from officers is the true root cause. Two narratives, both emotionally charged, both incomplete on their own, because here's what the footage ultimately confirmed. Agents did not ram the vehicle. They did not force the collision. They did not directly strike Dr. Davis's car. But they were there, close enough that witnesses described seeing federal lights in their rear-view mirrors seconds before the impact. And in high-risk policing, proximity matters. Experts later testified that human decision-making under stress narrows perception. When Lopez accelerated, he wasn't thinking about school zones, or intersections, or innocent drivers. He was thinking about escape. And in that tunnel vision, he ran a red light. Dr. Davis entered the intersection lawfully. The rest was physics. The Department of Homeland Security eventually announced a policy review regarding vehicle stops in densely populated residential corridors. It stopped short of admitting fault. It did not concede wrongdoing, but acknowledged the importance of interagency coordination to protect public safety. For some, that was progress. For others, it was too little. Months later, Lopez was convicted of first-degree vehicular homicide and multiple related charges. He was sentenced to decades in prison. There was no applause in the courtroom, only exhaustion. Justice, in its legal form, had been delivered. But justice does not rewind mornings. It does not uncrumple metal. It does not return a teacher to her classroom. Herman W. Heseke, Ada eventually dedicated a reading garden in Dr. Davis's name. A small bronze plaque sits near a bench beneath a young magnolia tree. It reads, "In memory of a teacher who believed every child mattered." Students still pass that bench every day. Some of them are too young to fully understand what happened, but they understand absence, and absence is powerful. The case has since been cited in policy debates across multiple states. Lawmakers reference it when discussing federal-local coordination. Law enforcement academies analyze it in pursuit training modules. Advocacy groups invoke her name in arguments both for and against stricter enforcement. Her story became larger than the intersection where she died. Yet at its core, it remains painfully simple. A man chose to flee. Agents chose to follow. A red light turned green for one driver. And in 112 seconds, 3 lives were permanently altered. One ended, one imprisoned, and one community divided. True crime stories often search for villains and heroes. But sometimes the most unsettling cases are the ones where responsibility is layered, where decisions overlap, where legality and morality don't align cleanly. Savannah still debates that morning. But one thing is not debated. A teacher is gone, and no policy argument will ever change that. If this story shook you, if it made you question how quickly life can turn, remember her name. Because behind every headline is a human being who woke up expecting an ordinary day and never came home.